It was a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. At least, that's what everyone thought until one woman decided that the rules didn't apply to her. It started with a simple request. "Can I park a few cars in your driveway?" But what followed turned this once tranquil street into a battleground. A 2 a.m. police call, a fake parking agreement, and a battle for control of a small piece of concrete. This wasn't just a fight over parking. It was a fight for respect, for boundaries, and for the right to say no. What happens when a neighbor, too comfortable with her power, pushes too far? What happens when someone decides they've had enough? This is the story of a quiet neighborhood, a Karen, and a battle no one saw coming. There was a time when the sun always set peacefully over the quaint, quiet neighborhood. Residents exchanged smiles as they passed by, familiar faces that made up a tapestry of shared stories, trust, and respect. This was the kind of place where you could count on your neighbors, where evenings were spent sipping lemonade on the porch and kids played in the yard without a care. It felt like home, and the protagonist, an older retired teacher, had found comfort in these quiet streets. She had spent the better part of her life building a community, one that valued kindness and understanding. But that all changed the day Karen, a woman with a tendency to think she was the queen of the HOA, moved in. The protagonist, accustomed to peace, found herself slowly unraveling as the tranquility of the neighborhood began to fade, replaced by tension, entitlement, and the intrusion of a new, dominant personality. Karen had a way of speaking to people that made them feel small, as if her every word was a commandment. And that, my friends, was where the problem started, when Karen began demanding that the protagonist's driveway be used for parking her daughter's friends for their parties. It seemed harmless at first, just a small ask, but it set the stage for a battle no one saw coming. The protagonist was no stranger to standing her ground. Having spent decades in education, she had encountered a variety of personalities, some kind, some challenging, but never had she imagined facing someone like Karen. The first encounter was almost laughable, the casual tone with which Karen asked if she could park a few cars in the driveway. "Since you don't really use it on weekends," Karen had said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "why not let us use it for guest parking? Just a few cars. Nothing wild." Something in the protagonist's gut told her that this wasn't a harmless request. It was a veiled attempt at asserting control. She politely declined, explaining that she valued her space, her property, and the importance of boundaries. It wasn't about being difficult, it was about respect. But Karen's reaction wasn't what the protagonist expected. Instead of a simple "okay," Karen's face twitched, her smile tightening, as if she couldn't fathom someone saying no. "I just thought you'd be more neighborly," she said, her tone dripping with passive aggression. That moment marked the first real crack in the neighborhood's facade of peace. The protagonist realized then that this wasn't just about parking, it was a battle for control, one that would stretch far beyond a few cars in the driveway. And for the protagonist, it wasn't just a matter of principle, it was personal. A week passed without incident, but the tension remained. The protagonist went about her days, tending to her garden, reading books, enjoying the simplicity of life. Then, one night at 2 a.m., it happened. The flashing lights of police cars cut through the quiet of the night, waking the protagonist from a deep sleep. She rushed to the door barefoot, still in her pajamas, disoriented and bewildered. There, standing in her front yard, were 2 police officers. And there, clutching a cake box, was Karen. Karen wasn't just upset, she was in full-on attack mode. Apparently, some of her guests had been denied parking in the protagonist's driveway, and she had decided that calling the police was the only logical response. The officers were equally confused, but the situation quickly escalated as Karen began her rant about how unreasonable it was that the neighborhood wasn't more accommodating to her daughters, VIP guests. In that moment, the protagonist felt something shift deep inside. This wasn't just about a driveway anymore. This was about Karen's complete lack of respect for personal boundaries and her ability to manipulate the system for her own gain. The protagonist wasn't just fighting for parking space now. She was fighting for her peace, her dignity, and the simple right to say no. As the weeks went on, it became clear that Karen's actions weren't just a one-off incident. They were part of a pattern. The protagonist's driveway had become ground zero for Karen's growing sense of entitlement. It wasn't just about a few cars anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood being pulled into Karen's web of manipulation. It became a game of cat and mouse, with the protagonist trying to hold her ground while Karen tested every boundary. There was a sense of unease that lingered in the air, as if everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. And it did, when Karen tried to send 3 cars into the protagonist's driveway one afternoon, only to be blocked by cones. But Karen didn't back down. She had learned from her first mistake and decided to take matters into her own hands. The protagonist could feel the mounting pressure, the irritation of being pushed, the frustration of having her rights disregarded. The emotional toll was real, but what hurt the most was the realization that this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was a battle for personal integrity. As the protagonist fought to maintain control over her own property, memories of better days began to surface. There was a time when this neighborhood was a place of mutual respect, where neighbors looked out for each other, and disputes were settled with kind words over coffee. The protagonist would often find herself sitting on her porch, reflecting on the quiet beauty of her life before Karen arrived. She thought about the time she had spent with friends, the small acts of kindness exchanged, and the simplicity of life that seemed so far away now. But as Karen's actions became bolder, the protagonist felt like she was losing something precious. It wasn't just the driveway, it was the community. It was the trust and respect that had been built over years, now threatened by one woman's insistence on breaking all the rules. The protagonist knew that to win this battle, she had to be strategic. She couldn't rely on emotional reactions alone. She needed evidence. So, she began documenting everything. Photos, emails, texts, and notes were all carefully collected, each moment in the fight meticulously recorded. It wasn't just about defending her driveway. It was about showing the world what Karen had done, how she had manipulated everyone around her, and how her actions were not only disrespectful, but illegal. This was where experience truly mattered. The protagonist knew that in battles like this, patience was key. Every interaction was a new chapter in a long, drawn-out story. But the more Karen pushed, the more the protagonist realized that she wasn't just fighting for her property. She was fighting for the future of her neighborhood. The plot thickened when the protagonist uncovered Karen's hidden agenda. What had seemed like a one-time birthday party was actually a recurring business venture. Karen was hosting large-scale events at her home, using the neighborhood as her personal event space. She'd been advertising private events, baby showers, even corporate retreats, all while using the protagonist's driveway and the street as free parking for her guests. This discovery changed everything. It wasn't just about a few cars in the driveway anymore. It was about a pattern of deceit, manipulation, and exploitation. The protagonist realized that Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was running a business, and her VIP guests were nothing more than a cover for her illegal activities. This was the moment when everything clicked into place. Karen had been exploiting the neighborhood for her own profit, and it was time to put a stop to it. The emotional toll of the situation began to wear on the protagonist. The constant stress, the feeling of being undermined by someone who thought they were above the rules. It took a toll on her health, her peace of mind, and her relationship with the neighbors. She had spent her life building a community, and now, it seemed, she was fighting to protect it. It wasn't just about the driveway anymore. It was about reclaiming her peace, her dignity, and her right to enjoy her own property without fear of invasion. Every confrontation with Karen left her feeling drained, but every time she stood her ground, a spark of hope lit up inside her. She wasn't alone in this fight. There were others who shared her frustration, her fear, and her desire for justice. The protagonist knew that the best way to fight back wasn't through emotional outbursts or petty retaliation. It was through action. She quietly gathered her evidence, compiled her documents, and made sure everything was in order. She reached out to local authorities, shared her findings with the HOA, and started laying the groundwork for a legal challenge. This wasn't about getting even. It was about standing up for what was right. And as the days passed, the neighborhood began to rally around the protagonist. The whispers of discontent grew louder, and soon, people who had once been too afraid to speak out began sharing their own stories of Karen's misdeeds. This was no longer just one woman's battle. It was a fight for the community. The climax of the story arrived when the protagonist finally presented all of her evidence at the HOA meeting. With photos, logs, emails, and even video footage, she laid out the case against Karen. And as the evidence unfolded, something remarkable happened. The room began to shift. Neighbors, once silent, began to speak up, sharing their own experiences of how Karen had manipulated them, made their lives difficult, and undermined their sense of community. In the end, the HOA board voted to remove Karen from her position as vice president. It was a moment of triumph for the protagonist, not just because Karen was ousted, but because the neighborhood had reclaimed its dignity. The battle had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. And as Karen packed up and left, the protagonist couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of peace settle over her home once more. She had fought for what was right, and in the end she had won.